investing in property makes sense. Investing in the right property takes knowledge. Welcome to the Rewarding Property Decisions podcast. I'm Jarrod McCabe, Director of Wakelin Property Advisory. Join me for expert insights into the fundamentals, trends and opportunities to help you create long-term wealth through smart property decisions. Hi everyone, and thanks for joining me for episode 80 of the Rewarding Property Decisions podcast. So I'm fortunate today, straight off the top, to be joined by Jordan. Thanks for coming in, mate.
No troubles, Jarrod. Good to be here.
So Jordan and I wanted today to talk about something interesting that we've started to see come into the market this year. It's been quite interesting in Melbourne, particularly in 2024. The market, it hasn't been strong in terms of growth, but it hasn't been weak necessarily either. It's been tracking along, which is quite different to a number of the other capital cities around the country at the moment. We're starting to see probably a few more first home buyers come in. Now, they're not actively pushing prices up, but there's a bit more depth, I would say, in that sector of the market. And it's interesting because the interest rates would normally be something that would really impact that sector of the market. Probably hasn't as much, or it did, but they're probably finding their level and getting used to that, factoring in terms of costs. But potentially that's because a lot of first home buyers also are tenants, and they are finding that sector of the market quite difficult. So what sort of alternatives have we got in terms of having a home to live in?
Yeah, probably the gap is probably closed between what the cost of rent is and what the repayments are. I suppose particularly if mum and dad can help them out, minimise what their borrowings are. It probably starts to get a bit more parity, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. So what that's led to, and what we're starting to see a bit more happening, is tenants expressing an interest in buying the property they're currently residing in. Now, that's not unusual. We hear that on a fairly regular basis. The unusual factor at the moment is that it's actually coming to fruition, and tenants are actually being able to buy properties from the landlord. So why is this the case? And I guess this is what we wanted to discuss today. How come it's all of a sudden different now, whereas in the past, where we've seen this, I would say 99 times out of 100, it doesn't go anywhere. So I guess to start with, it's probably good for us to give a bit of background as to how this has played out in the past, what's brought it on, and then we can go through some of the other elements as to why this is being successful at the moment. So in the past, what have you seen? And I'll give you my thoughts as well, but what have you seen in terms of when this has come about and why has it been knocked on the head?
Yeah, it's oftentimes comes about when a tenant has something to think about, I suppose, and that's usually around every 12 months, lease renewal time.
Yeah.
And so property manager asks for, our owner would love you to stay on, 12-month lease, gets the tenant thinking, do I want to stay here for the next 12 months? They oftentimes are thinking, well, I'd love to be in my own home in the next 12 months.
Yeah.
So would the owner be open to an offer? Would they look to sell instead of release? But what we've found is that more often than not, and you don't dismiss those approaches when we're guiding our clients, our owner clients, you don't dismiss the approach, but more often than not, it tends to peter out. Because either the tenant has no realistic understanding as to where market value might be. They could be just tyre kicking, I suppose.
Finance isn't organised.
They're just not in a position as much as the motivation might be there. Or sometimes, depending upon the market as well, a soft market, I think people understandably, they try to just test out to see if there's a owner that might be a bit stressed, financially stressed, and they can
take advantage
of that. And on the other side of the coin too is that sometimes when the market's strong and you receive that interest from the tenant, oftentimes what we say to our clients are, look, we should expect there will be plenty of competition for this property. We stay the course, we go through the normal process if it's say coming up for sale, and that's the intention is to sell it. If there's an approach from the tenant, would you be prepared to sell earlier to me? We just simply say, look, the tenant's actually interested. They're going to be the most motivated party because if it's sold to somebody else, particularly an owner-occupier, they've got to vacate. Let them put their hand up at auction and compete with it. So we've got a market that's a bit different at the moment.
And it is. So I guess that brings us to what is the difference now? What has changed at the moment? And it's almost a bit of a perfect storm, really, because both parties seem to be motivated for differing reasons, and it's bringing the tenants up. And it's bringing some of the investors down in terms of, so not necessarily that their properties aren't performing, but the market's not overly strong at the moment. And given that what we do see is first home buyers and investors over the years do typically compete for similar type properties, in that they're looking for good quality apartments or villa units or small houses. So there is an element there of, well, they're looking at the same types of properties, which is why there's been a lot of attempts at government intervention at different stages to try and assist first home buyers, and usually that's at the expense of an investor. But at the moment, what we're starting to see is that they are starting to come onto a level. And I guess what we're seeing, that's for differing reasons. I mean, from an investor's perspective, why are they looking at selling, and why are they coming to an understanding that a tenant might be their best buyer or might be a suitable buyer? Interest rates obviously are at a peak, and given if they've bought properties over the past 10 years, they're probably almost now at the highest point they've been for some of them. The increasing in land tax, particularly in Victoria, that we're seeing, that's making things really difficult, particularly for there's plenty of buyers who've never paid land tax.
Yeah, changes the Residential Tenancies Act. That a lot of these aren't unreasonable,
No.
but it's just another impost of the last, probably there's another raft of them coming in probably later this year. But a couple of years back, the changes that required all sorts of, again, mostly reasonable expectations in terms of how a property is maintained and how a property is provided to a tenant, but it's a cost.
Yeah.
And so it's sort of death by a thousand cuts in a way.
Absolutely.
So,
and that's the feedback that we get regularly from our clients, and that's what a lot of them are feeling. But for some, it's just a case of, I mean, potentially baby boomers as well. They've had these properties for 15, 20, 25 years. They've served their purpose. They've had great levels of growth. And you're at the stage of life where you don't need to be looking after properties anymore. So now is the time to sell. Yeah. So there's a fair motivation there for a lot of investors.
Yeah, and from the other side of the fence, tenants, as we alluded to before, what's the alternative, particularly if this is a property that's going to be sold anyway?
Yeah.
The owner has indicated that intention, and that's motivated the tenant to say, if that's the intention, maybe I can jump in first and negotiate before it goes to market. Tenants looking at, what are the alternatives if I have to vacate?
Yeah.
And usually, again, it's usually what we would recommend is that a notice to vacate is served in order to present the property in the appropriate manner, maybe do a bit of maintenance work, all that sort of thing to get the property to market. They've got 60 days. They say, if I'm out of here, well, what's the alternative? And in most sectors of the market, whether you're looking to rent a 1-2 bedroom apartment or a house, it's pretty tight.
The vacancy rates are probably at record lows at the moment. And the other thing that we're seeing too is that with mortgage rates and the interest rates being a bit higher, but not necessarily as high, but then with rents going up, the balance is almost there where paying rent versus paying a mortgage, in some circumstances, there's not a lot of difference. So tenants are getting to the point of, well, if I've got the ability to pay a deposit and put the funds down, well, then I may as well be paying off my own mortgage rather than paying off someone else's. Yeah. The other thing that I think comes into play too, which we had in a recent podcast that I did with Mark McCrindle, is that Gen Z have got property ownership as a very high priority in their life. So for a lot of others, so for millennials, property ownership wasn't a priority. It was more, there was other things that they prioritised. They still wanted to, but for Gen Z, it's quite high up. So if that's a priority in your life, then that's going to bring, and if they're currently tenants, that's going to put, if there's an opportunity put in front of them, perhaps I can take that opportunity right now.
So it's sort of a confluence of events where it's coming together, where it actually, there is something to talk about.
And so there's motivation on both sides. We're getting, and if an investor feels as though there's an opportunity to be had and they don't have to go through the headaches of a full campaign, and they're going to achieve what might be a similar type price, well, they see that as a win. A tenant looks at it and says, well, I don't have to go and find a new property. I can go and buy, and what I know is a good property because I've been living here for however many years prior to, and I know the pros and cons of this property, and I know that it's really good. Well, it takes the pressure off me. I don't have to go out and compete. I don't have to move anywhere. And so that perfect storm sort of comes to fruition, which is really good. And that's how I guess we see that it does benefit both parties. Are there other benefits that you've seen around that people could get out of doing this? Yeah,
well, certainly from... and I'll take it from our client's perspective when we're advising them on the way out of property, it's the cost savings that can be made as well. Now, that shouldn't that shouldn't be the overarching reason, but what it means is that there is room to move in terms of what you're prepared to accept from a tenant could well and truly be less than going to market, simply because you've got sometimes considerable cost savings that can be made by not engage an agent, and that's important. You don't do it directly.
No.
That's where you get yourself in a bit of strife, particularly if things fall over and you still need to deal with the tenant. You want someone in between you, so engage the agent. They're still going to charge, but there's not going to be any marketing. That's getting more and more expensive. You don't have to present the property.
Yep.
So presentation furniture, coat of paint, carpet. If it's been tenanted long term for maybe 10 years, that's probably going to be needed to put the property in its best position when you take it to market. And the one that shouldn't be discounted either is, or the cost saving, I suppose, is that continuity of rent.
Yeah.
Because the tenant is going to stay there, paying their rent throughout the settlement period, right up until settlement.
Yeah.
And that can be, many thousands of dollars,
well, you work that backwards,
$15,000.
and if you serve your notice to vacate and then they're out for, let's say, in an ideal scenario, it's probably 2 weeks before you go to market. Then you've got a 4-week campaign, so there's six. And then you might have another 90-day settlement where you might, if you're fortunate enough to get 30 or 60, there's not many 30-day settlements in this market because it's hard from a from a loan perspective to get it all sorted. So best case scenario, it's probably 60-day settlement. There's 3.5 months.
Well, yeah, a 90-day settlement is 13 weeks plus 6 weeks of all of the previous, and that's if the tenant doesn't give their 14-day notice immediately, and you've got a property that's perhaps vacant a little longer than what you might have wanted it to, and you don't think it's wise to bring forward the auction. You're looking at best part of 19, 20 weeks of vacancy without any rental income, and that's significant. So you add these costs up, I suppose. And then you can start to see, well, okay, look, the tenant mightn't have a capacity to, or I mightn't be able to negotiate, absolute top dollar, but it might make sense to start giving it some consideration.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so what's going to be the best way to go about this is probably the best thing. And again, most of our listeners are investors, property owners, or looking to be property owners. So we'll look at it from that side of things as opposed to looking at it from the tenant side of things at this point. But what's the best way to negotiate with a tenant, and how do you start that process?
Yeah, okay. I suppose that the first point is that there's got to be an intention to sell anyway. And I'm probably targeting it at clients, owners that are looking to sell irrespective, and this is an option for them. Do we go to market or do we sell?
We're not testing the waters here. We're going to be selling.
We're going to be selling. As we've said, that's usually accompanied with a notice to vacate that's served for the reasons, and 60-day notice, assuming that there's no lease covenant, it's month to month, or at the least the lease will expire at a certain time. You can't break the lease. The 60-day notice is served, and that clock starts ticking.
So I think the important thing there too, though, is that it's not been the agent or the owner going to the tenant and saying, we're going to sell, are you interested? The key thing here is we've served the notice to vacate with the accompanying paperwork, so the authority and things that's required, and then the tenant comes back and expresses the interest. It's really important that it goes that way. Because if you go to the tenant first and offer, then you're on the back foot from a negotiation perspective.
Yeah, exactly. The tenant can quite rightly say, haven't thought about it. What are you prepared to sell it for? And what you put to them might be well and truly less than what they're prepared to or able to pay. So it's whoever, we always take the view that, look, whoever initiates the process, it's really incumbent on them to kickstart things and give an idea as to what they're prepared to sell at. Or from the other side of the coin is, well, if somebody's approaching you, well, it's incumbent on them to say, listen, if you're interested, I have capacity around about this sort of level. And it's important that you get that. You understand, you've got a baseline there from which to negotiate from, but you're in control of it then as the owner, I suppose, if it's coming that other way. So that's a good point. But if that notice to vacate is served, you give yourself options. The tenant might come to you and look to negotiate, and that's great. But if things all fall over and you just can't come to an agreement with the tenant, you've got that date where they're required to have vacated the property.
As you said, the clock is ticking.
And that clock is ticking. So every day that goes by within that notice period, that's focusing the tenant's mind on being able to negotiate an outcome with you as the owner. So that's important. But I would suggest that the most important thing is to have as as well as you can an understanding as to, well, what's current market value? So
Yeah.
what could we expect at auction?
Yeah.
That's the intention, unless we're diverted to sell to the tenant. What should we expect? What's fair market value?
Yeah.
So first things first. And then what are the likely cost savings or the costs? Flip it around. What are the costs in going to market?
Yeah.
So put another way, what can we potentially move on in terms of negotiating in the negotiation? What are we prepared to accept if a tenant lowballs it?
Yeah.
To put us in a net position that's the equivalent of actually going to auction,
Yeah.
or selling it in the open market.
So working your way backwards, and
Yeah.
factoring all those costs in, like we said before about the vacancy period too, the costs that you may have to spend on the property, the rent, the marketing expenses, and then you work back to, well, if we get all that, we're in a pretty good position accepting this. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that's the price you accept.
No, but you know what your bottom line is
Yeah.
then, at least. And sure, there's a risk that in not taking your property to the market that you leave something on the table, so to speak. But there's also the risk in not accepting, going to market and then finding that, well, things have changed in the meantime. We've got an interest rate increase in August that wasn't expected a few months ago, and that might dampen the market, or anything else that can happen. There's a risk either way, and that's just, you've just got to balance those risks, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, next steps. So then I guess the other thing that you mentioned the other day too, with one that we were dealing with was, and I think this is probably back a step, but it's the when the notice to vacate's issued and you have to accompany that with the authority, it's really important to black out certain elements within that authority, because there's elements of that authority that are none of the tenant's business.
Yeah, whether or not you're entering into any negotiation or expect to with a tenant, there are certain things you don't really, nobody needs to know.
No.
Nobody needs to know your email address, your mobile phone number as
Your
the owner.
personal address.
Your personal details. Yeah, exactly. But also with the idea that this notice to vacate might get the tenant's mind thinking, and you might be negotiating with them. You don't want the marketing costs, for instance.
Yeah.
It's not. They don't need to know that, but that could be a negotiating point for them to come back and say, oh well, but you're going to spend this anyway if you don't sell to me. So the more information you have, the less the person you're negotiating with has. You're going to be in a stronger position.
Yeah.
And likewise, a company on the sale authority is going to be a range.
Yeah.
Well, that might be relevant, and it's entirely relevant for the approach that you had intended to go down, and that's taking it to market.
Yeah.
But that range, I don't view that as having any relevance when you're dealing with a single party not going to market. You could want more than that. You could be prepared to accept less than that.
For the reasons that we just spoke about, in terms of the costs and things that you're taking into account. So it shouldn't form part of that. And again, it's keeping extra knowledge to yourself that you don't need your opposing party to have.
Yeah, exactly. And sure, you might want more than what's on that range. And I'm not talking about underquoting. What I'm talking about is that range is designed to elicit some sort of understanding as to what the market is prepared to.
And that's what you might be prepared to accept at the start. And we've got to see what the campaign prevails.
Yeah.
And you may have to pull back your expectations after not having the level of interest that you may well have expected or hoped. So it's more keeping it up your sleeve so you've got that extra knowledge.
Yeah. But I think that the main thing though, that the notice to vacate is very powerful.
Yeah.
Because it's a real call to action from a tenant's part. They've got to meet your expectations. You've got to be able to negotiate an agreement, otherwise that they need to.
And again, it's going to get to a point, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it's wait until the date that the tenant has to be out. It's probably a certain number of weeks beforehand, and they'll be experiencing and feeling that too, because they've got to find somewhere else to live.
Yeah.
So if they're not going to be able to come to an agreement with you as the owner that this is going to be an acceptable price, then we're going to have to move out.
Yeah.
And so if that'll come about certain weeks beforehand. And the really important factor, I think, from an owner's perspective in conjunction with their agent, is to make sure that message subtly and delicately, without being aggressive, is continually reinforced. We're still progressing towards our campaign, whether it's an auction or a private sale. that's what we're still heading towards, unless you want to put a stop on it.
Yeah.
And if you want to put a stop on it, it needs to be X and it needs to be on these terms and whatever the requirement is. But that's what we're working towards, unless we can come to an understanding. So keep getting quotes done, keep getting on works that you might require, or stylist, and if it gets to the point, photography, that sort of thing. And because then if you do have to get the photos taken, then all of a sudden, okay, well, I've already had to have the photos taken because you haven't negotiated with me. So I'm now going to get that work done, and I've paid for that because we didn't put a stop on things. So it keeps the pressure up, and you need to remember that from a negotiation point of view.
Yeah, exactly. Probably the only other thing I think is important to add too is that if everybody can come to a happy understanding and agreement, is not to rescind that notice or not to withdraw that notice to vacate immediately.
No.
You don't say, well, okay, you've signed a contract, we can withdraw with your agreement. Both parties have to agree, and it would be very much in the tenant's interest for that notice to vacate to be withdrawn, but you don't do that until it's entirely unconditional.
Yeah.
You don't want to be withdrawing it the day you sign the contract, the tenant cools off in 3 days. Or if it's subject to a building inspection, for instance, and that could be quite okay, as long as it doesn't mess up with your plans to take it to market if things do fall over. But you don't want the withdrawal of that notice and then find that for whatever reason, unlikely, potentially, it doesn't follow through.
Then you've got to start your time ticking again.
You've just blown your campaign.
Yeah.
You've then got to start the whole process, and that could push it into a time of year that isn't
desirable.
Yeah.
Look, there's a lot of things to take into account, but I think there's some good. I think one of the key points too here with something like this, and it is with any negotiation, is that both parties need to feel comfortable. If you go into it with the mindset of I have to win and they have to lose, particularly in this scenario where there's benefits to both sides of putting a deal together here, it can fall over pretty quickly. So I think it's important to make sure you feel as though you haven't short sold yourself by not going to the market, but the tenant has to feel like they've had some form of win by not going and searching for some other property that they could have purchased as well.
Yeah.
Very good. All right, that's about it for episode 80 of the Rewarding Property Decisions podcast. Thanks very much for joining us. As always, if you'd like further information, please visit our website, wakelin.com.au. Otherwise, we wish you all the best with your property decisions. Thanks for joining me, Jarrod.